The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 4th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then Jesus began to say to the people in the synagogue in Nazareth, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. The Gospel of the Lord. So this fall, I'm going to be leading a tour to the Holy Land, and while we're there, we're going to visit Nazareth, Jesus' hometown, which is the setting of today's Gospel reading. And as I've talked to people about this, and shared my experiences in past trips that I've made there, going to some of these places you read about in the Bible really does make the story come alive. You learn things that you simply cannot experience or really understand if you're just reading the story out of the book. So, for example, when you go to Nazareth, you learn some interesting stuff. You learn, for example, that Nazareth is in the middle of nowhere. It was in the first century, it still is today. It is off the beaten path, it is central to nothing. You understand why then people like Nathanael in John's Gospel, when he is told, "We have found the Messiah, he is Jesus of Nazareth," the first words out of Nathanael's mouth are, "Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's a nothing place, it's near nothing." Second thing you learn about Nazareth is that while it is kind of pretty, nobody would go there for the scenery. It doesn't have dramatic views or anything, and you would think that would not be the case because Luke thinks that it's built on the edge of a cliff where you would have this dramatic overlook. But actually, Nazareth is built on the edge of a hillside, and it's kind of pretty and everything. There is no cliff there. There is a cliff about a 3-kilometer hike away, which we take a bus to because we're not going to hike, and it's through the woods and everything, and it does have spectacular views of the Jezreel Valley, and you can see that, but it means that if the people in the synagogue in Nazareth really wanted to throw Jesus off the cliff, he had about a 3-kilometer hike through the woods to kind of find someplace else to go and sneak away. I used to read this story before I went there and think, oh my gosh, this is like Jesus being on the edge of the Grand Canyon and people were coming at him. How did he escape? Well, it's not so hard. You got 3 kilometers of woods. It's pretty easy. And the other thing you learn when you go to Nazareth is that today it's actually a fairly good-sized town. It's one of the larger cities in northern Israel today, but it is like that only because it is the hometown of Jesus. And basically, a whole tourist industry has been built up there since maybe the 3rd century. In fact, archaeologists believe, when you see the ruins of what was there in the 1st century, that during Jesus' lifetime, maybe 200 people lived in that town. It was tiny. It was not a place where hardly anybody came from it. And all of this has helped me to realize that when I read this story that I just read from Luke's Gospel about Jesus going back to his hometown and going and talking to people in the synagogue, it helps me to understand that folks in that synagogue probably thought, you know what, we are this little dinky place of no accord where nobody comes and thinks we're important, but now one of our hometown boys has done good. He has gone out, he has begun to be famous. We can tell that God is doing something through him, and that means that now that he has come home, we deserve some recognition, or we're going to get some recognition finally. Maybe Jesus will do double the miracles that we heard that he did in Capernaum and other places. Maybe Jesus will stay and make this the base of operation, and then we're finally going to be the center of something. At least maybe we should be recognized and respected now as the cool kids in town because one of our hometown guys has made good. And as Luke tells the story, that's clearly what people were thinking. And when Jesus refuses to show acts of favoritism or perform miracles simply for their own amusement, they get mad. They wonder if all this stuff they've heard about Jesus is really true. They figure that if Jesus isn't going to do great things for them, then maybe it's not worth having Jesus around after all. And they get angry and they chase him out of town. The irony is that for the next 20 centuries, Nazareth has been famous for being the hometown of Jesus. For the next 20 centuries, Nazareth is one of the few places people have heard of in the Bible, and it has a name that people actually can pronounce because you've heard of it so often. And for the next 20 centuries, people have gone and visited Nazareth not because of what Jesus did for those people, but because of what God did through those people. It was through that community, those people in Nazareth, that God sent the Messiah into the world. And it was because of what God did through them that ended up making the difference, not because of what Jesus did for them on a particular day in the synagogue. So it turns out that Nazareth and those 200 people that lived there really were an important part of God's plan to redeem the world. But they were important not because God did something for them, but because God did something through them. And, you know, while it's always easy, the cheap and easy thing to always do in a sermon is to talk about how these people, these ancient people, they didn't get it, they missed it, blah, 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 blah. In fact, it's really easy for us, too, to do exactly what those folks did and to ask the question, what has God done for me? What has God done for us? What do I wish God would do for me or for my community? How is God doing something splashy that I can see exactly this is the cool new thing that God is doing in my life and what God is doing that I can point to and say, see, this is what God is doing that helps me to be a respected person that says, look, I'm really connected to God. That's easy for us to get caught up in that as well. And when we do that, we often do exactly what those folks in Nazareth did. We miss out on what God is doing through us, what God is doing with us. It doesn't seem so splashy, and we miss out on what it means to actually be a community of God's people. So what's that all about anyway? Last weekend at our congregational meeting, I made the point that as a Christian community, we are living in a really different social and cultural context than we have for generations. As we move into the future, it's important for us to recognize that things around us have changed, and that in fact, God is calling us to adapt to a new kind of way of being and a new kind of way of living. It means that being a community of God's people is going to be different for us than it has been for generations. And I think that really was essentially the challenge that Jesus gave to the synagogue in Nazareth as well. Jesus was already dramatically changing things. And things were going to work differently. They were going to have to learn to be a different kind of community of God's people. They needed to adapt. And, you know, in that one moment, they didn't do such a good job of adapting. But the challenge was the same. Adaptation has both possibilities and potential pitfalls. And Jesus called all communities, has called communities in the past and today, to learn how to adapt. How do we adapt? What would that kind of adaptation look like for us? Shockingly, I do not have all the answers to that. However, looking at Jesus' experience in Nazareth, it seems to suggest that part of adapting to new and different ways of living as God's people means realizing that our purpose as a Christian community is to help people have an actual, real, living experience of Jesus in their lives. That is the major purpose. I mean, that's what the people in Nazareth had. They physically had Jesus right there in the center, right there in their community. I mean, how cool is this, right? You come together and you say, we want to have God's presence here, and there is Jesus right there in the midst of them. And they didn't appreciate that because they were busy looking at, okay, what neat, cool thing are you going to do? Instead of simply saying, part of the reason that we gather together, the major reason we gather together, is to have this living experience of God so that we know that we are not alone. So that we know that we have strength to go out into the world and face the unknown. So that we know that somehow or other we're going to have strength to share with others. And that knowledge that God is there with us, even if we don't have anything flashy to show for it, that experience is worth having. That's the really important, cool thing. And that was the thing that Jesus was calling people to recognize. Today, he says, in your presence, the Scripture's fulfilled. Here I am. God's presence is with you. You can know that. You can count on that. You can be sure of it. And that's one of the core things that we need to keep in mind as we think about what it means for us to be community in the months and years ahead. And that also means that we're called to be people as we adapt to consider how God has worked through us to help give life and hope and the presence of God to people that we may never have met. You know, people did not travel very far in the first century. They often, you know, Jesus may have been one of the few people that traveled down to Capernaum and started meeting people. A lot of these folks in the synagogue of Nazareth, they didn't personally know anybody in Capernaum. They had just heard the stories that God was doing something through Jesus. And what would have been really cool is to be able to say, you know what? Through us, God raised up Jesus, and God's presence was shown to all these other people. That's cool. We're part of God's plan because through us, God is sharing presence and love and light with other people. But they were so hung up on what was God doing for me that they couldn't see that their purpose in being a community was to raise up people like Jesus who could share God's love with other people. And that often is absolutely key to what Christian community absolutely has to be. Finding ways to share with folks, even if they never know who we are. We're going to share a whole bunch of soup with people as a physical act of sharing God's love. They don't know us. They never will. We don't know them. Doing those kinds of things are important, not because we get famous for it or because nobody else does it. It's because part of being a Christian community is living as Jesus' hands in the world. Passing our faith on to our kids and sharing it with others in our lives is important, not because it's so famous and people are going to put us on the news, but because if we don't do it, nobody else will. And that's part of what being Christian community is supposed to be about. That's what being God's people is about. That's what Jesus called the first folks in Nazareth to be. That's what Jesus calls us to be about as well. And for us too. And maybe this is more a difficult adaptive change than they faced. But part of adapting also means accepting that being a community which experiences Jesus and shares Jesus with the world is worth doing, even if the world around us doesn't think who we are or what we do is important anymore. And that's hard for Christian communities, especially in the United States in the early 21st century, when we've had 15 centuries, at least in Western culture, of Christian community being one of the solid bedrocks of society. And it's supposed to be a good thing to be part of a church. And churches are supposed to be out there changing the world, and if you're not doing things that are big and splashy, and you're not the cool kids anymore, then why are you here? And we've got to be able to say, you know what? We share a living experience of Jesus in our lives. We share that with others. And that's why God has called us together. And because of that, we do a lot of other things too that may or may not be splashy. But we got to accept that we're not the cool kids anymore. And sometimes that's the most important part of adaptation. Because that was the problem the folks in Nazareth were having. They thought, finally, we get to be the cool kids in Israel. We get to be the hometown of Jesus. We get to get recognition. We get to be the people who come. People come to us and say, hey, you guys are really with it. And when that that didn't happen. They had difficulty with that adaptation. So what does it mean for us to be a community of God's people when Jesus is calling us to a different way of living and a different way of understanding ourselves? That was the challenge that Jesus put before the folks in Nazareth, the challenge that Jesus puts before us as well. So I'm going to be thinking a lot more about that while I am on sabbatical, but it's a question all of us in Christian communities need to be thinking about, considering, and acting upon. And while none of us are going to know all of the answers, or maybe even have a good idea, there are some things that we can be absolutely certain of, and they're the same things that those folks in Nazareth could be certain of as well. We can be absolutely certain that Jesus is and will continue to be present in our midst. Jesus is not going to walk away and abandon us. We can be absolutely certain that Jesus is going to continue to lead us into the future, even when it's unclear to us what the future looks like. And we can be sure that Jesus will continue to make us part of God's future, even as he made those folks in Nazareth and included them as part of God's future, even when we get things wrong.